Welcome to the Owl's Edge, where smart gets wise. I'm your host, Susan Black-Beth, founder and managing partner of Auspicious Owl Group. On the Owl's Edge, we'll be bringing conversations, insights, and learnings about franchising and private equity out from behind closed doors and turn hard-earned experiences into your competitive advantage. Thanks for joining me. Let's swoop in and get wise. Live from Aviary Studios, welcome back to the Owl's Edge. I'm your host, Susan Black-Beth, and today we're going to do something just a little different. Over the first 4 episodes of the Owl's Edge, I've had the privilege of sitting down with some of the most thoughtful, experienced, and just genuinely good humans I've had the pleasure of knowing throughout my time in franchising. That's Doc Cohen, Liberty Bernal, Greg Nathan, and Mike Isakson. As I've been listening back to those conversations, something struck me. These 4 people, even though they have different backgrounds, different decades of experience, different seats at the table, kept coming back to broadly the same topics. So today I want to pull those themes together from our first 4 episodes. These are the ideas I believe matter most, whether you're a franchisee, a franchisor, or a capital investor coming into this world. Let's swoop in and get wise. All right, theme 1, trust is a multiplier and people are the point. These 2 ideas, trust and people, kept showing up together across every conversation, and I've come to believe that they're really the same idea. You can't separate them. Doc, who was the very first franchisee of Great American Cookies back in 1973, told me that in the early days, there was very little trust between him and the founders. They fought, they argued, they protected their own turf. And then something shifted. They stopped fighting about territory and started asking, how do we improve store construction? How do we grow sales together? And Doc said that's when the trust really started to build, not from a handshake or a contract, but from working towards common goals. Mike called trust the huge multiplier. And he said, if private equity firms can't measure it when they walk into a deal, they need to bring in people who can sense it and who can see it. Because no strategy, no matter how sound, will gain traction in a franchise system with trust underlying it. Greg gave us the psychology. Trust, he said, comes down to one question. Do people feel safe with you? And he named 3 things that erode trust most reliably, and that is lack of transparency, perceived unfairness, and not being listened to or not feeling heard. He even explained the neuroscience to us that fairness isn't just a nice value to have, it's biological. And when people feel treated unfairly, it activates the disgust center in our brain. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, be sure and go back and listen to him talk about his mom. It's one of my favorite moments from the first 4 podcasts. They don't just get frustrated when they feel they're being treated unfairly. They get viscerally offended. And if you think about when you've been in situations like that, it's true. We feel like this just visceral disgust. Later in that episode, Greg did come back and call me out on the carpet for being somebody who loves the change I get to choose. That was also quite the moment. There's also the human side of all of this, and Liberty put this in the most gut punch way possible. She said that when she was carrying her franchisees through a very turbulent time after her company was acquired by PE, she described herself as feeling like she was carrying their houses on her back because she knew there were mortgages behind those businesses, sometimes second mortgages and rolled over retirement funds. That is the reality of franchising. Mike came at the same thing from the investor side. He said private equity sometimes forgets, and frankly, some franchisors do too, who is actually putting in the operating capital. It's not the fund and it's not the franchisor in most cases. It's the franchisee. Every new truck, every software upgrade, every hire, that comes out of the franchisee's pocket. And Mike told a story that I won't soon forget. And that was that $50,000 might mean this franchise owner sold their beloved 1946 Harley motorcycle to come join us and to take a chance on themselves. We can't forget that stuff. Trust isn't just a nice to have. It's a risk mitigation strategy. It's structural. It makes every other lever in the franchise model actually work. And it is built slowly, meaning trust is built slowly through consistent, transparent, and fair actions. And it takes an incredibly long time to build, and it can be destroyed very, very quickly. A key takeaway for me from along this theme line is that if the people behind the model aren't seen, and I use behind sort of just structurally, meaning the franchisees who are foundational to the model, they aren't seen, they aren't respected, and they aren't supported, the model does collapse, right? Full stop. Trust isn't soft. It's the foundation in which everything else is built on. Here's a question that I would encourage you to sit with. This might be more directed towards our franchisors, but it can be applied across our different audience members, our operators, our franchisees, and our investors. But think about a franchisee or a team member that you've lost touch with recently. What would it mean to them and to your system in turn if you showed up for them this week? Not because something is broken, but just because they matter. I received a call yesterday from a very dear friend of mine who will be a future guest on Owl's Edge. And he said to me, I just wanted to thank you for being a friend. Here are 2 connections you made for me that have positively impacted my week, my month, and ultimately will my year. That we've already got a really deep sense of trust, but that really mattered to me. It showed me that he hasn't forgotten about me and the steps that I've taken to try and help and advance his business. What if you reached out to someone you've lost trust with just to tell them that they matter and to thank them for what they're doing to support you and your system, your business? What if? Theme 2 is to have the hard conversation early. This point came through primarily from Lib, and I think it might be the most practically useful idea across all 4 episodes, especially for anybody in franchise development. Liberty told me that if she could go back and talk to 22-year-old Liberty, she would tell herself it's okay to talk about the uncomfortable, right? Not everything is roses, rainbows, and unicorns, right? There are hard realities when you go into business for yourself, but not by yourself in franchising. There will be things that might not work out. We are so conditioned in franchise sales to tell the most positive version of the story. And she said there's actually nothing wrong with having a real, honest conversation about potential downside risk. For Lib, the mindset shift for her was realizing that the most people-pleasing thing she could do was to have the tough conversation up front, not later when somebody's already in over their head. I added onto her story at that point that I would rather a prospect be upset with me before they've put the second mortgage on their house than after. That's not pessimism, guys. That's realism. I want to draw a distinction here that I think about a lot, and that is the difference between being nice versus being kind. I've spent a lot of my career, especially the early days, and a lot of my life, frankly, being nice. I have since learned through a lot of experience that the most gracious thing that you can do for someone is to be kind. And kind means making sure they have as many facts, even when they're not the facts they want to hear, as you are in a position to give them. It means telling the truth before the stakes get higher and higher. This applies in development, yes, of course, but it also applies when PE comes in and changes a business model, when a CEO needs to have a real conversation with a franchise advisory council about a direction that may be uncomfortable or may not be well received, when a field support person needs to tell a franchisee that their unit economics are just not headed in the right direction, and clearly we have to pivot and make some changes. While silence on the hard stuff may feel like protection, and it's just a avoidance tactic really, it's definitely a setup for a much, much more painful conversation later. A key takeaway for me on this theme is that the courage to say the hard thing early is a really important leadership skill in franchising. If you have knowledge or intuition that something isn't the right fit or that a system isn't the right fit for someone, say it. Say it with kindness, say it with grace, say it with empathy and understanding of trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, of trying to hear this information, but do it before it costs somebody everything. Here's a question to sit with on this theme. Where are you right now holding back a conversation that someone in your world actually really needs to hear? What would it cost them, not you? What would it cost them if you wait another 6 months? Theme 3, culture is behavior when no one's watching. Greg gave us the clearest definition of culture I've ever heard, and it's how people naturally behave when no one is incentivizing them. And then he said something that stopped me in my tracks, and that is that culture is the most powerful way to change behavior, and it costs nothing. He also said culture has 2 drivers: the history of the organization and whoever is in charge right now. And the scary implication of that is this: a new leader who comes in not showing respect, with a command and control attitude or behavior, can destroy a healthy culture that probably took years to build in months, sometimes more quickly. And a leader who comes in and actually listens, who shows real, authentic respect, can bring a rancid culture back to life in give or take 6 months. Mike built on this from the investor side. He said cultural alignment is consistently undervalued in franchise acquisitions. Founders build systems around a vision, a set of values. And the best private equity investors that he's seen understand that this culture is a competitive advantage, not a soft asset to be reorganized. Doc had a practical litmus test. Go to the annual franchisee conference and watch what happens. If the atmosphere is positive, attendance is strong, and franchisees are raising their hands to be the first to test something new, even when it costs them, that's a healthy culture. If the meeting is a complaint session, that's a data point. I will tell you, I have attended tens upon tens. I would say I've probably attended 50 franchisee conferences over my career, ones that I've spoken at and keynoted for, ones that I've emceed, ones where I've worked with franchise advisory councils. That point from Doc is incredibly true. Just go and observe the engagement, observe the conversations. And if you do see that it's a complaint session, don't ignore that data point. Greg had a very pointed message for anyone coming into a franchise acquisition, and that was to not walk in and immediately roll out new values and new language. Spend time, he suggested at least a year, understanding what matters before you touch it. Ask why the traditions exist. Build credibility first. If you introduce your new values before you've earned any trust, people will be skeptical from jump, and you'll have lost them before you've even begun. A key takeaway for me on this theme is that culture isn't a program, it's a pattern. It lives in what gets rewarded, what gets tolerated, and who the informal leaders are. Understand it before you try to change it. A question for you to sit with. If you stepped away from your brand for a month and came back to observe it from the outside, what behaviors would you see that nobody's formally asked for? What does that tell you about the real culture of that organization? I highly recommend that you do your best to step outside, get to 50,000 feet, and observe your brand or your system in as objective as a way as possible. We know we can get too close to the trees to even know we're in a forest. Whatever it might take for you to elevate and get above the culture in order to observe it, I highly recommend you do. And the fourth and final theme that really rolled through all 4 of these episodes for me is responsible growth. Said differently, slow your roll. Every guest touched on this in some way, but Liberty and Mike were the most direct. Liberty said her single biggest concern for the next 5 years of franchising is that systems are not slowing their roll on development. She keeps hearing executives brag about how many franchises were sold while quietly ignoring how many are closing, how many might not open, and how many franchisees are being left without adequate support. I will say I am hearing very similar stories. Liberty gave an example of a system that grew aggressively for years, then had to pull back its support infrastructure because it couldn't fund that infrastructure anymore. Those franchisees were left alone. They couldn't even get a call returned. This is a worst case scenario. Mike connected directly to operational math. If you've sold 30 new franchise owners, has anyone actually sat down and calculated how many hours of support that requires in year 1? He tracked what he called days since last contact, and he wanted it under 30 days because a franchisee at 99 days without a meaningful touch point is a franchisee who feels forgotten. And a franchisee who feels forgotten is a franchisee who starts making noise, or worse, starts quietly failing. I keep saying this, and I'll keep saying this. Franchise systems are not meant to grow exponentially fast. They're not meant to be built that way. The support that is required in that first 12 to 18 months is heavy. It's intensive. If you can't deliver it, don't sell it. Period. Full stop. This connects back to where we started, which is trust and the people behind the investment. If you sell a franchise to someone who mortgaged their house to get here, and then you don't answer their call, you haven't just made a business mistake. You've broken a promise to a person who, in many cases, risked everything. A key takeaway for me is that growth for the sake of growth is not the goal. Responsible growth is. If you cannot support franchisees that you have, adding more franchisees does not solve the problem. It compounds it. Here's a question to sit with on this theme. If you looked honestly at your current support to franchisee ratio, not the ratio you're pitching to investors, but the real one, the one you talk about in your leadership meetings, or should be, would you say your existing franchisees are getting what they were sold during the development process? And if not, what needs to change so that they are before you add a single additional franchisee? In closing, When I started the Owl's Edge, the goal was pretty darn simple. I didn't want the people who have shaped this industry over the years to be erased. I truly believe that there are very few business problems that we are solving for the first time, especially in franchising. If you take the time to care enough to boil down most challenges in franchising, the root tends to be one of two, if not both, of one thing here. It either is communication, or it's a breakdown in trust, or a combination of the two. When Doc said years ago that he felt like he had been erased or been forgotten, that's simply something that I can't allow to happen. There's too much that's been learned. There's too much for us to gain from learning from one another. It totally warmed my heart when I saw Doc walking down one of the hallways at the most recent International Franchise Association show in Vegas in February of 2026. And I gave Doc a hug and he said, "All anybody wants to talk to me about is this podcast. You've unerased me." I didn't unerase you, Doc, but I did bring your wisdom back to the forefront. And for that, I am incredibly proud and delighted to be able to do this. It's a real honor. What I didn't anticipate is how much the wisdom and the friendship and the gift of time from these 4 conversations would ultimately weave into one coherent message. Not 4 separate conversations, but one conversation told through 4 different lived experiences. I didn't anticipate that they would tie together that well. I wish I was the genius that could tell you that I intentionally built it that way. I didn't. It's that these themes are common when franchising is done well. When we follow them, we in turn will be doing franchising well. Trust is the multiplier, and people are the point. Have the hard conversations early. Culture is everything, and it is fragile and has to be nurtured every day. And growth without support is just a different kind of failure. I'm grateful to Doc, to Liberty, to Greg, to Mike for their time, their honesty, and their willingness to let these conversations happen in the light, out in the open, and not behind closed doors of a boardroom. This industry deserves these conversations. And I'll be honest with you, recording this episode changed something for me too. It reminded me why I built Auspicious Owl Group and what I want it to stand for. These conversations aren't just content, they're a compass. If something from today resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. Please share this episode, leave a review, and come find me at auspiciousowlgroup.com. And until next time, be smart, be wise. Have a super week. Thanks for joining me on the Owl's Edge. If you found this conversation enlightening, please share it with others who influence outcomes for franchise stakeholders. To explore more on the topics of franchising and private equity, visit us at auspiciousowlgroup.com and be sure to follow the Owl's Edge wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, be smart, be wise.